Good afternoon, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this really important conference, which tackles an equally important subject, the topic of climate change, which, despite being such an important topic, unfortunately, has not been given the priority which it deserves. So I'm really glad to see this initiative, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing what the other participants will have to say during this conference. I will be tackling the topic of climate change from a human rights perspective. So over the next minutes, we will be looking at how climate change is going to impact a number of fundamental human rights. But before we start, I'd like to share this quote with you. So, climate change is an urgent global problem requiring a global solution. So, here I'd really like to emphasize the word urgent, the fact that this is something that needs to be tackled really quickly, really efficiently, really urgently. And it is a problem which can only be somehow solved if we work together, if we rope in all the different stakeholders, both at the national level, but not only, also our partners within Europe and also beyond Europe. It is only if we work together that we will be able to come up with some kind of solution. So the fact that climate change is an urgent issue is not new to us. In fact, our parliament had already declared a climate emergency back in 2019. However, despite this, I feel, at least from my own observations, that the measures which are being put forward to tackle climate change are not being addressed with the same sense of urgency, with a sense of emergency. So despite declaring the climate emergency, I would like to see more of measures which are implemented with the same sense of emergency. Now, human rights, you might be asking, what do human rights have to do with climate change? And fairly so. So before we delve into that, however, I'd like to remind what human rights are. So human rights are rights which belong to all of us. They are universal, they are legal guarantees, so they are protected within our legal framework, and they are intended to protect individuals and groups of people against actions, but also omissions, which somehow interfere with these fundamental freedoms and rights which they have. Now, we know that climate change is bringing about a number of consequences which we are already feeling to a certain extent. So the increase in the temperature and the impacts which that creates. So going forward, this illustration really gives us a good overview of the consequences which we will be experiencing unless we do something to somehow mitigate these consequences. So these range from physical consequences, but also the social and economic consequences which come along with that. Now, these physical consequences and socio-economic consequences invariably will have an impact on a number of rights which we all have. And I'm going to look at these different rights which we have listed here. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but we will show how climate change puts a number of these rights in danger. But before I do that, I would like to share a quote by Flavia Pansieri, who is the Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights at the United Nations. And she's saying this: climate change, human-induced climate change, is obviously an assault on the ecosystem that we all share, but it also has the added feature of undercutting rights important rights like the right to health, the right to food, to water and sanitation, to adequate housing, and in a number of small island states and coastal communities, the very right to self-determination and existence. So quite serious consequences here. Let's have a look. For example, the right to life, which is, I would say, our most fundamental right, the right to be alive, the right to live. And a report of the World Bank is showing that further health impacts of climate change could include injuries and deaths due to extreme weather events. So extreme weather events like floods, like tsunamis, also weather events which might not be so sudden, so increase in temperature and desertification. These are events which are really putting our lives at risk. These are events which can and have in some places in the world already had very severe consequences on the lives of people. So I think this is something of huge concern and something that we really need to be reflecting upon. And then, hand in hand with the right to life is the right to self-determination. So another report here is saying that climate change challenges the ability of people in small island states. So here especially they are focusing on people who, like us, live in small island states, to continue to live on their traditional territory and to enjoy and exercise their right to self-determination. So essentially the increase in temperature and the consequences of that might actually limit our right, for example, to continue living in our territory, in our country, because of the fact that there is the possibility that our territory will become uninhabitable. So something else to really reflect upon. The right to development. So over the past years, we have really progressed in terms of economic development, also in certain aspects of social and cultural development. But according to the president of the World Bank, here we're seeing that climate change might actually roll back, he's saying, decades of development. So what's he saying? He's saying that not only will we not be able to continue progressing, but in some cases we will also start regressing. So our right to development from both an economic, a social, and a cultural perspective here is being put at risk. And then the right to food, our right to be able to have access to good food, healthy food that keeps us alive, that keeps us healthy. And the increase in temperatures globally are putting this right at risk. So many people, many more people will not have access to food, and this will put them at risk of hunger and will also increase the likelihood of deaths. That's through hunger, but also that's through malnutrition. And then the right to water, which we need for our health, for our well-being, to live essentially, but also to be able, for example, to grow our crops. And the IPCC report, I'm sure many of you have now heard of the IPCC, which is an expert panel on climate issues, which publishes some very authoritative reports. And the IPCC is saying climate change is projected to reduce renewable surface water and groundwater resources in most dry subtropical regions, intensifying competition for water. So we're envisaging that there will be water scarcity both in urban and rural areas, okay? And that will impact on the supply of food, for example, on the possibility to engage in agriculture and grow crops. But not only, it will also create further competition between areas, between regions, between countries. So it's something that can also result in conflict, and we need to think about that too. Then the right to health. According to World Bank reports, climate change will cause health impacts that are likely to increase and be exacerbated by high rates of malnutrition, including potential increases in vector-borne diseases and heat-amplified levels of smog that could exacerbate respiratory disorders. So an increase in respiratory diseases is being envisaged here as well. The right to housing, our right to have a roof over our heads, and climate change is also threatening this right in a number of ways. For example, when it comes to extreme weather events, again, these can destroy homes, and not only would these events destroy our homes, but they will also displace people and sometimes whole communities. So especially when it comes to people who live in coastal areas or people who live in islands like us, the rise in sea level, in fact, creates an even more, let's say, extreme threat for people who live in these areas. Now, who is at risk? Obviously, everybody is at risk. We are all humans. We all have an aspiration to live a good life, a fulfilling life, a dignified life. However, we know that there are people who are, to a certain extent, more vulnerable to the risks posed by climate change. So we have, for instance, those people who live in vulnerable areas, for example, people who live in small islands, in low-lying coastal zones, or in arid regions, or in the poles, but then also people who perhaps have less access to resources, and these include people who are poor or at risk of poverty, children, and also future generations. And in fact, Flavia Pansieri, who I'd like to reference once again here, is saying this. She's saying those who have contributed the least to greenhouse gas emissions will be the ones who bear the greatest burden, the poorest people in the poorest countries, their children, and all our children. So, in effect, the ones who are the least at fault are the ones who will unfortunately be suffering the worst consequences. Now, this is where the state comes in. The state has a duty to ensure that our human rights are protected. So the state has an obligation to respect, protect, fulfill, and promote all human rights. And failure to take affirmative action, so failure to be proactive in this regard, proactive in preventing harms to our human rights caused by climate change, okay, is a breach of this obligation of the state to protect our rights. So if the state is not looking at the foreseeable harms, including long-term harms to our human rights and to our availability of these rights, then the state is breaching its obligation to protect our rights. Now, in order to protect our rights, the state has to limit greenhouse gas emissions, that what we refer to as climate change mitigation. But it also needs to be able to assess the current and future negative impacts that can be brought about by climate change, and it needs to take action to prevent those harms as well. So it needs to have some foresight to be able to assess what consequences we're going to experience and to take action to ensure that those negative consequences do not arise. Our human rights declarations and treaties also ensure that there is a level of accountability. So those who are entrusted with protecting our rights can be held accountable. And in order for that to happen, the rights holders, people like us, the ones who have these rights, need to have access to effective remedies to ensure that they can claim those rights and uphold those rights, including through judicial means, so including through our courts and our justice system. Now, I have spoken a lot about the state, and that is because primarily it is the state who has the responsibility of ensuring that our human rights are not breached. But not only, businesses also have a role to play. And in fact, this role is outlined quite well in the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So they speak about the fact that states have to protect the human rights of people, including breaches of those rights which can arise from harm created by businesses and practices which are implemented by certain businesses. But then also these guidelines tell us that businesses from their end, they have a responsibility to respect human rights of people and the responsibility to do no harm. So if there are practices which are in fact harming people, or they can harm people also in the future, those practices need to stop. The way forward, we're seeing that there are some really serious consequences that are going to arise if we don't manage to mitigate climate change and adapt to climate change properly. There is a lot that can be done. I do believe that we have a lot of expertise locally to be able to come up with solutions, as I mentioned earlier as well, in collaboration with partners from beyond our shores, solutions which will benefit us not necessarily in the immediate term, in the short term, but possibly in the medium to the long term. However, it depends on how brave we want to be. The measures that need to be implemented are not necessarily the popular measures, are not those measures that are going to please everyone. Not everybody is going to be happy with change. Some change can be costly, some change can be painful, but at the end of the day, we all know what's right. So it very much depends on how brave we want to be, how much we agree on where we want to get to and how we're going to get there. So we really need to work together to come up with these solutions. To close off, I'd like to share a quote, this time by MEP Gutteland, who is an MEP who worked a lot on the EU climate law. And she had this to say. She's saying, unless we rapidly cut our emissions, the science is crystal clear. The future will be catastrophic. So really, there's no room for interpretation here. The science is clear. The emissions are causing harm. This harm caused by our emissions is going to also put our fundamental rights at risk. So we really need to take action, and we need to take action now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. I thank you a lot for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts, and I look forward to an interesting discussion and to working with many of you to continue addressing this huge challenge that we have ahead of us.